She wasn't what the tabloids would have predicted for a man like him. Plus size, soft-spoken, raised by a father who'd worked in finance and taught her everything he knew before cancer took him 3 years earlier. She'd walked into that cathedral with her chin up, despite knowing, because everyone in that room knew, that the groom hadn't wanted her. And still, when he humiliated her in front of his family, his associates, his entire carefully curated world, she didn't cry. Not there, not where he could see it. "You'll do as you're told," Alessandro said later, in the car taking them from the ceremony to the reception, not even looking at her. "Smile for the photos, say the right things to the right people. After tonight, what happens in this marriage is my business, not a performance for an audience." Maya turned toward the window instead of answering him. She'd promised herself, standing at that altar, that she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching her break. Her father used to tell her that dignity was the one thing nobody could take from you, unless you handed it over yourself. She intended to keep hold of hers, even if it meant swallowing every word she wanted to say to the man beside her. The reception unfolded exactly as Alessandro intended. Cold, transactional, a business event wearing a wedding's clothes. Guests offered congratulations that felt more like condolences. His men eyed Maya like she was furniture that had been placed somewhere inconvenient. Alessandro barely spoke to her at all, choosing instead to disappear into conversations with men in dark suits who kept glancing toward a laptop one of them carried like it held something urgent. That's when Maya noticed it. She wasn't looking for anything. She was simply standing near the head table, holding a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, when she caught sight of a printout one of Alessandro's associates had left face up on a nearby chair. Numbers, columns, transfer codes. Something about the pattern caught her eye immediately, the way certain things do when you've spent years watching someone else work through spreadsheets at your kitchen table every night after dinner. Her father used to run his fingers along rows of numbers like he was reading a story instead of a ledger, and he taught her, patiently, exactly what to look for when something in the numbers didn't add up. This didn't add up. 3 separate transfers, spaced days apart, each one routed through an account structure designed to look unremarkable unless you knew precisely what you were searching for. Maya had seen structures like this before, not in Alessandro's world, but in the stories her father used to tell her about men who stole quietly, patiently, confident nobody would ever notice. Someone was moving money out of Alessandro Moretti's empire and doing it carefully enough that whoever was supposed to be watching hadn't caught it yet. She almost said something right then, opened her mouth, in fact, ready to walk over and tell the man who just humiliated her in front of hundreds of witnesses that his business was bleeding money from the inside. Then she thought better of it. Why would he believe her? To him, she was an obligation in a wedding dress, not someone whose opinion carried weight. Worse, if she brought it up too soon, whoever was behind those transfers might notice she'd seen something, and Maya had no interest in becoming a target on her wedding night for a crime that had nothing to do with her. So she folded the printout, tucked it into her clutch when nobody was watching, and smiled through the rest of the reception like the obedient, invisible bride everyone expected her to be. Little did Alessandro know, the woman he just publicly rejected was holding the first thread of a conspiracy that would eventually bring his entire empire to its knees, and the only person capable of unraveling it before it destroyed him. That night, alone in a guest room in his estate, doors locked, veil still pinned in her hair, Maya spread the printout across the bed and started reading the numbers her father taught her to see. She had no idea yet how far this went. She had no idea it would lead her straight to the people Alessandro trusted most. And she certainly had no idea that the man who'd humiliated her at the altar would one day owe her everything. 3 days passed before Maya said a word about it. She used those 3 days the way her father taught her, quietly, methodically, without drawing attention to what she was actually doing. While the household staff whispered about the new Mrs. Moretti and how strange it was that Alessandro barely acknowledged her presence at meals, Maya sat in the estate's East Wing library with her laptop, cross-referencing the transfer codes from that printout against every public filing she could find connected to Moretti Holdings. None of it made sense on the surface. That was the point. Whoever built this had studied the same techniques her father once explained to her over dinner, back when she was 17 and thought finance was the most boring subject on earth. He'd shown her, patiently, how thieves who understood accounting didn't need guns or threats. They needed patience, access, and the confidence that nobody smart enough to catch them was actually looking. By the fourth day, she'd traced the pattern far enough to know one uncomfortable truth. This wasn't outside interference. Whoever moved that money had access most outsiders would never get. Employee-level access, maybe higher. If you're the kind of person who likes figuring things out one step ahead of the characters, you're going to enjoy where this goes. Subscribe now so you don't miss the reveal waiting a few chapters from here. Maya found Alessandro in his study that evening, standing over a desk covered in reports his men had brought him, reports she'd later learned that told him nothing useful at all.
"I need to show you something," she said. He didn't look up. "I'm busy." "It's about the money disappearing from your accounts." That got his attention. Alessandro's head lifted slowly, and for the first time since their wedding day, he actually looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone you're trying to figure out. How would you know anything about that? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed up as one. Maya set the printout on his desk without flinching. "Because I saw this at the reception, and because my father spent 15 years teaching me how to read patterns like this one. 3 transfers, same structure, different accounts, spaced out to avoid tripping alarms. Whoever's doing this knows exactly how your systems flag activity, which means it's someone close enough to know what those systems look for." Alessandro studied the page for a long moment, jaw tight, saying nothing. Then he looked back up at her, and something in his expression had shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of something closer to attention. "Where did you get this?" "Someone left it on a chair at our wedding. I don't think they meant for anyone to see it." He was quiet for so long that Maya nearly turned to leave. Then he said, without looking at her again, "Sit down." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't an apology either. Not for the altar, not for the car ride, not for any of it. But it was the first time since she'd met him that Alessandro Moretti had asked her to stay instead of dismissing her. Over the following 2 weeks, Maya became something she'd never expected to be inside that house. Useful. Not decoration, not an obligation fulfilling a family debt. Useful, in the way her father had always told her mattered more than beauty or charm. The kind of useful that made people who once ignored you start listening.
Alessandro gave her access to the financial records, reluctantly at first, watching her the way you watch someone you don't fully trust yet but can't afford to dismiss. Maya spent hours in his study, poring over numbers, while his men shot her looks that ranged from suspicious to openly hostile. Dominic, his second-in-command, made no effort to hide his contempt. "She's been in this family 2 weeks," Dominic said one afternoon, loud enough for Maya to hear from the next room. "Now she's got access to everything? You've lost your mind, Alessandro." "She found something your people missed," Alessandro answered, and his voice carried an edge that ended the conversation. Maya didn't say anything about it later. She'd learned over years of being underestimated that the best response to people who doubted you wasn't an argument, it was proof. And proof, eventually, was exactly what she found. The theft went deeper than 3 transfers, much deeper. Maya traced the pattern back nearly 18 months, discovering a slow, careful drain that had been siphoning funds out of Moretti Holdings long before anyone noticed anything was wrong. Whoever orchestrated it hadn't been greedy. They'd been patient enough to avoid triggering any alarm, patient enough to build something that could run undetected for years if nobody like Maya ever came looking. "This isn't outside interference," she told Alessandro one night, spreading printouts across his desk while he stood over her shoulder, closer than he'd been since their wedding day. "This is someone inside your organization, someone with real access, financial officer level at minimum." "That's a short list of people," he said quietly. "I know." Neither of them said the next part out loud, that a short list of people meant a list of people Alessandro trusted, which meant whoever this was had spent years earning the kind of access that only comes from being close to him. Family close, or close enough to feel like family.
Working together like this changed something between them, slowly, in ways neither of them fully noticed at first. Alessandro started seeking her out in the evenings, ostensibly to review new findings, but staying longer than the numbers required. Maya found herself watching him differently too. Not the ruthless boss who'd humiliated her at the altar, but a man carrying more weight than he ever let anyone see. A man whose reputation for cruelty didn't quite match the way he sat with her in silence some nights, exhausted, guard finally lowered. She was starting to see someone underneath the man everyone feared. He was starting to see someone he'd almost missed entirely. Neither of them had any idea how much that would cost them both before this was over, or how much they'd eventually need each other to survive it. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over two people when they've started trusting each other without meaning to. Alessandro noticed it first, the way Maya no longer flinched when he entered a room, the way she'd started arguing with him about numbers instead of deferring the way everyone else in his life did. Nobody argued with Alessandro Moretti. Maya did it constantly, and somehow he'd started looking forward to it. "You're wrong," she told him one night, tapping a finger against a spreadsheet he'd been staring at for 20 minutes. This account wasn't flagged because of volume, it was flagged because of timing. Somebody's moving money right before your quarterly audits, which means they know your audit schedule. Half my organization knows the audit schedule. Half your organization doesn't know which accounts get spot checked versus which ones get a full review. That's a much smaller list. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. You should have been running finance for someone a long time ago. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but coming from him, it landed like one. If stories about people discovering they've badly misjudged someone hit different for you, you already know to hit that subscribe button. This one's about to get a lot more complicated. Small moments built between them over the following weeks. Alessandro started bringing her coffee before she asked for it, black, the way he'd noticed she preferred. Maya started staying up later than she needed to, not because the work required it, but because she liked the particular silence of his study at midnight, liked the way he'd occasionally break it to ask what she thought about something that had nothing to do with the investigation at all. He told her one night about his father, a man who'd built the first version of this empire through cruelty so casual it barely registered as violence to him by the time he died. Alessandro had spent his whole life trying to be different and failing more often than he wanted to admit. "I humiliated you at our wedding," he said, out of nowhere, staring at the fireplace instead of her. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something about it for weeks." Maya didn't answer right away. "Why did you do it?" "Because I was angry that I didn't have a choice, and you were the only person in that room I could take it out on without consequences." He shook his head. "That's not an excuse. I know that." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." But something had shifted between them regardless. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of it. Maya had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who took one look at her and decided they already knew everything worth knowing. Alessandro was the first person in years to actually take it back, to admit out loud that he'd been wrong about her. It should have been enough time to build something solid. It wasn't nearly enough time before everything fell apart. The collapse started small. A shipment delayed at customs that should have cleared without issue. Then a business partner in Marseille who stopped returning calls entirely. Then, within the space of 4 days, 3 separate accounts frozen without warning, each one tied to transactions Alessandro's lawyers couldn't explain.
"Someone's building a case against us," Dominic said, slamming a folder onto Alessandro's desk. "A real one. This isn't random." Millions disappeared over the following week, not siphoned slowly this time, but pulled out in a single devastating move that left half of Alessandro's liquid assets gone by the time his accountants finished counting the damage. Enemies who'd spent years too afraid to move against him suddenly smelled blood. Old rivals started making calls. A man named Castellano, who'd hated Alessandro's father before he hated Alessandro, requested a meeting for the first time in a decade. "He's not requesting anything," Alessandro said grimly, reading the message. "He's testing whether I'm still standing." Worse than the money, worse than the enemies circling, someone inside his organization had leaked information, details about shipping routes, financial structures, the kind of information that only a handful of people had ever had access to. And when Alessandro's lawyers finally traced the leak back through months of records, searching for the thread that connected everything, the evidence pointed somewhere Alessandro never expected. It pointed to Maya's father. "That's impossible," Maya said, when Alessandro showed her the documents, hands shaking as she read through pages that claimed her father had been in contact with Castellano's organization for years before he died. My father spent his whole life keeping people like that away from decent families. He wouldn't... The documents say otherwise. The documents are wrong. Alessandro's face had gone cold again, the warmth of the past weeks replaced by something Maya hadn't seen since their wedding day. Or you knew exactly what you were marrying into. Maybe that's why you were so interested in my finances from day one. The accusation hit her like a slap. You think I orchestrated this? You think I married you, moved into your house, spent weeks helping you trace a theft I could have just as easily ignored? Also, I could what, Alessandro? Steal from a man who already hated me? I don't know what to think anymore.
Then think about the fact that I found that printout before anyone else did. Think about the fact that I've spent every night for a month trying to save your empire instead of destroying it. He didn't answer. And in the silence that followed, Maya realized something that hurt worse than any humiliation he'd put her through at the altar. After everything, after every small moment that made her believe he'd started to see her differently, Alessandro was choosing to believe the evidence over her. Their relationship, barely a month old and only just beginning to feel real, cracked down the middle at the exact moment it mattered most. Neither of them knew yet how wrong that evidence was, or how much they'd both regret the distance growing between them before the truth finally came out. Maya spent that night in the guest wing, door locked, the same room she'd retreated to on her wedding night months earlier. Different circumstances, same loneliness. She didn't cry, not at first. She'd promised herself a long time ago that she wouldn't hand her dignity to anyone who hadn't earned the right to see it break. But somewhere around 2 a.m, staring at a ceiling she'd memorized over weeks of sleepless nights, the weight of it finally caught up with her, and she let herself feel exactly how much it hurt to be doubted by the one person she'd let herself trust. Her father had never betrayed anyone in his life. She knew that with a certainty that went beyond evidence, beyond documents, beyond anything Alessandro's lawyers had pulled together. But knowing something in your bones and proving it to a room full of powerful men who wanted a scapegoat were two very different problems. If you've ever had someone you trusted choose doubt over you, you know exactly how heavy that silence feels. And if you want to see how Maya turns it around, subscribing means you won't miss what's coming.
Alessandro didn't sleep either. He sat in his study long after the house went quiet, staring at the same documents that had ended their conversation, turning them over the way you turn over a stone, hoping to find something different underneath it the second time. Something about the papers bothered him. He couldn't name it yet, but it sat there, nagging, the way small inconsistencies always did before he understood why they mattered. He thought about Maya, about the weeks of late nights, the arguments over spreadsheets, the moment she told him bluntly that he was wrong about an account flag and turned out to be right. He thought about how she'd never once asked him for anything since the wedding. No money, no favors, no leverage over the empire she'd apparently spent a month trying to steal, according to evidence that arrived suspiciously well-timed the moment their partnership started actually working. That was the thought that stopped him cold. Suspiciously well-timed. Alessandro pulled the documents closer, reading them again with different eyes this time, not looking for confirmation of what he already believed, but searching for the cracks he'd been too angry to notice the first time through. The dates didn't align quite right. The signatures on 2 of the pages looked close but not identical to samples he pulled from Maya's father's old business filings. Someone had built this file carefully, but not carefully enough for a man who'd spent 20 years learning to spot exactly this kind of forgery. By sunrise, Alessandro had a suspicion he didn't want to have, and nowhere near enough proof to act on it. He found Maya in the kitchen, the first place in the house she'd claimed as something like her own, sitting with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "I need to apologize," he said. Maya didn't look up. "You already made your position clear last night."
I was wrong to make it. The documents don't add up the way I thought they did. He pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down even though she hadn't invited him to. I spent half the night going through them again. Something's off. I don't know what yet, But I know I shouldn't have believed them over you. You didn't just believe them over me, Alessandro. You believed the worst version of me existed the second the evidence gave you permission to. Her voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it, something raw. I understand you've spent your whole life trusting almost no one. I understand that makes suspicion your first instinct. But I thought, after everything, you'd trust me before you trusted a stack of papers someone conveniently left for you to find. He had no answer for that, because she was right, and they both knew it. Let me help you find out who actually did this, she said finally. Not because I need you to believe me, because my father's name deserves the truth, whether or not you ever fully trust me again. That was how they ended up back in his study together 2 days later, working in a silence that had lost its old warmth, but hadn't yet turned back into hostility. Cautious, careful, two people rebuilding something that had cracked, but not yet broken. Maya focused on one detail that kept nagging at her, the timing of when the documents implicating her father had surfaced. Someone had produced them almost immediately after Alessandro started giving her real access to his financial records, as if her growing usefulness had triggered someone else's panic. Whoever built that file needed you to distrust me quickly, she said, spreading a timeline across his desk, which means whoever's behind this was watching us closely enough to know exactly when to strike. That's a short list of people, Alessandro said again, echoing words from weeks earlier, except this time the weight behind them felt different.
Maya nodded slowly. It's someone who has access to forged documents that look convincing enough to fool your lawyers. Someone who knew when to leak the theft to your rivals for maximum damage. Someone who's been one step ahead of both of us the entire time. Alessandro's jaw tightened. He'd been running through the same list in his head for 2 days, and every path led somewhere he didn't want it to go. Someone close enough to know his schedule, his weaknesses, his blind spots. Someone he trusted without question for years, the way you trust family. He wasn't ready to say the name out loud yet, not until he had proof solid enough to make it undeniable. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a suspicion was forming that he desperately hoped was wrong. Because if he was right, it meant the person who'd spent months tearing his empire apart from the inside wasn't an enemy at all. It was someone who'd grown up in the same house as him, someone he'd spent his entire life protecting. The break came from a place neither of them expected. Maya had spent 3 days combing through her father's old files, the ones she'd kept in storage since his death, unable to bring herself to sort through them until now. Grief has a way of making paperwork unbearable, but if someone had gone to the trouble of forging documents to frame a dead man, Maya reasoned there might be something in his real records that told a different story. She found it in a folder he'd labeled simply, "For Maya, only if necessary." Inside was a second set of financial records, one she'd never seen before, dated years back. Not evidence of betrayal, the opposite. Her father had built an entire shadow system tracking irregularities inside Moretti Holdings long before Maya had ever heard Alessandro's name. A private audit trail documenting exactly the kind of theft they'd spent months chasing, except her father had started building the map years earlier. Her hands were shaking by the time she called Alessandro into the room.
He knew, she said, voice barely steady. My father knew someone was stealing from your family before you even took over the business. He wasn't working with your enemies. He was protecting you from them. Alessandro read through the pages in silence, and Maya watched something break open in his expression. Not disbelief this time, but the particular grief of realizing you owe someone an apology they'll never get to hear. This is the part where things get personal for Alessandro. If you want to see how far he's willing to go to make it right, subscribing means this story keeps landing in your feed. Why would he do this without telling anyone? Alessandro asked quietly. Because he didn't know who to trust either. Maya kept reading, piecing together years of careful notation. Look at this. He was tracking specific account patterns going back to before I was even born. He must have discovered something dangerous and realized he couldn't take it to your father without knowing who else might be involved. Buried in the folder was something else, a second document, more recent, dated only months before her father's death. A financial tracking system built quietly, designed to trace every dollar that moved through Moretti Holdings' more obscure accounts. Not just documentation of theft, a weapon against it. He left this for me, Maya whispered. He knew something was going to happen eventually.
He built this specifically so I'd have it when I needed it. Alessandro stared at the pages for a long time before speaking again. Your father spent years protecting my family, and I let people tell me he betrayed it. You didn't know. I should have trusted you before I trusted a lie. They spent the next 2 days running her father's system against the current financial data, cross-referencing years of quiet observation against the theft that had nearly brought Alessandro's empire to its knees. The system worked exactly the way her father designed it to: patient, precise, incapable of missing the kind of pattern someone smart enough to hide from ordinary audits would still leave behind.
And slowly, carefully, it started pointing somewhere neither of them wanted to look. The access required to move money as precisely, the knowledge required to forge documents convincing enough to fool experienced lawyers, the information about audit schedules that only a handful of people ever had. All of it converged on someone close enough to Alessandro to know everything about his operation from the inside. Someone he'd never once considered a threat because he'd spent his entire life protecting her from becoming one. Isabella, his younger sister. Alessandro sat back from the desk like he'd been struck, refusing at first to accept what the pattern was telling him. It's not possible. She's never had access to accounts at this level. She's had access to you, Maya said gently, which means she's had access to everything you know, everyone you trust, every schedule and system you've built. That's more dangerous than direct account access. He shook his head, but even as he did it, Maya could see the pieces falling into place behind his eyes, small things he'd dismissed over the years as nothing, questions Isabella had asked that seemed innocent at the time, moments she'd been present for conversations she had no real reason to attend. She's my sister, he said, and for the first time since Maya had met him, his voice cracked with something that wasn't anger. I raised her after our mother died. I kept her out of this world specifically so she'd never have to carry what I carry. Maybe that's exactly why she resents you for it. The words landed harder than Maya intended, but she didn't take them back, because somewhere in her father's careful notes was a pattern that told a story neither of them wanted to believe. A story about a young woman who'd spent her whole life watching her older brother inherit power, respect, and control, while she was kept safely, deliberately, on the outside of it all. Alessandro didn't sleep that night, and neither did Maya. They sat together in his study long after the house went quiet, going through every account, every transaction, every carefully hidden thread that connected back to Isabella. And with each new piece of evidence, Alessandro felt something in him break that had nothing to do with money at all. By morning, the picture was undeniable. Isabella hadn't just orchestrated the theft, she'd arranged the marriage itself, using the old family debt as cover because she'd known, somehow, some way, that Maya's father had left behind a system capable of exposing everything. Marrying Maya into the family hadn't been about honoring an old agreement. It had been about getting close enough to make sure Maya never found what her father left behind. Except she'd been too late. Alessandro closed his eyes, hands pressed against the desk, carrying the particular grief of a man who just realized the greatest threat to everything he'd built had been living under his own roof the entire time, and that the woman he'd humiliated on their wedding day was the only person who could help him stop her. Isabella noticed the change before Alessandro said a word. She'd always been good at reading him, better than anyone in some ways, because she'd spent her whole life studying him the way people study something they're planning to take apart. When Alessandro walked into her apartment that evening, calm in a way that felt wrong, Isabella knew immediately that calm wasn't the same thing as unaware. "You found something," she said, before he'd even sat down. "I found everything." What followed wasn't a confrontation built on shouting. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. Isabella didn't deny it once he laid the evidence in front of her. Her own signatures disguised inside forged documents. The account access logs Maya's father's system had traced back to her personal devices. Months of careful theft that had nearly destroyed the empire she claimed she wanted for herself.
You spent your whole life handed everything, she said, voice sharp with years of resentment finally given permission to surface. I watched you inherit power I was never allowed to touch. Father trained you. Father trusted you. I was the daughter kept safe in the other room. While you learned how to run an empire, I understood better than you ever did. So you decided to destroy it instead of asking for a place in it. I decided to take what should have been mine from the beginning. This is where the story earns everything it's been building toward. If you've made it this far, you already know it's worth staying for the ending, so go ahead and subscribe before we get there. Isabella hadn't planned on getting caught, which meant she hadn't planned an exit either. When Alessandro made it clear the evidence was already secured, already documented, already beyond her ability to bury it a second time, she made one final desperate move. She had Maya taken. It happened fast, the way real danger always does. 2 of Isabella's men intercepted Maya outside the estate that same night, bundling her into a car before she had time to call for help, leaving nothing behind but a dropped phone and Alessandro's name half-spoken into a voicemail that cut off mid-sentence. Alessandro found the message 20 minutes later, and something in him went cold and precise in a way it hadn't since the earliest, hardest years of building his empire. He didn't call the police. He didn't call his lawyers. He gathered the only men in his organization he was certain hadn't been compromised, and he went to find his wife himself. Maya, for her part, wasn't waiting quietly to be rescued.
Tied in a room at a property Isabella's people used for exactly this kind of situation, Maya kept her composure the same way she had at her wedding, the same way she had through every humiliation and doubt that followed it. She listened, she watched. And when one of the men guarding her stepped out to take a call, she used the few minutes alone to work her hands free of a knot, tied by someone who clearly hadn't expected a plus-sized bride to know anything about escape. Her father had taught her more than finance over the years. He taught her patience. And patience, it turned out, was exactly what this moment required. By the time Alessandro's men breached the property, Maya had already made it to a side door, moving quietly through a hallway she'd mapped out from sound alone. She wasn't running to escape. She was running toward the room where she'd heard Isabella's voice, because some instinct told her Alessandro was walking into a trap his sister had built specifically for him. She was right. Isabella had a gun raised when Alessandro stepped through the door, and for one suspended second, nobody in the room moved. Maya arrived just behind him, breath caught in her throat, watching the 2 Moretti siblings face each other across years of buried resentment that had finally come to this. "You won't shoot me," Alessandro said quietly. "Whatever you've done, whatever you've told yourself justifies it, you're not that person. You don't know who I am anymore. I know you're my sister. That's never stopped being true, even now." It wasn't Alessandro's words that changed anything. It was Maya stepping forward, placing herself deliberately between the gun and the man she loved, voice steady despite everything. "Whatever happens next," Maya said, looking directly at Isabella, "you get to decide right now whether you're someone who destroys what's left of your family or someone who still has a chance to be part of it. That choice is still yours. Nobody's taken it from you yet." The gun lowered slowly, Isabella's hands shaking, years of resentment finally breaking apart into something closer to grief. What followed wasn't simple. Isabella faced consequences. The empire she tried to steal wasn't hers to inherit, and the theft, the forged documents, the danger she'd put Maya through couldn't be erased with an apology. But Alessandro chose, in the end, not to destroy his sister the way she'd nearly destroyed him. He chose accountability over revenge, a harder path, but the only one that let him look at himself honestly when this was finally over. Weeks later, in front of the same guests who'd watched him humiliate his bride at their wedding, Alessandro stood beside Maya and told the truth in front of all of them. He admitted the cruelty of that day. He admitted he judged her before he knew her, dismissed her before he understood what she was capable of, and nearly lost the one person who'd saved everything he'd built. He gave Maya's father the recognition he'd been denied for years, clearing his name publicly, permanently. And he gave Maya something no arranged marriage had ever promised her, an equal place beside him, not as an obligation fulfilled, but as a partner he'd chosen, finally, with his whole heart. The marriage that began as his greatest humiliation became the truest thing in his life. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, hit subscribe and stay close. There's more where this came from, and I don't want you to miss it. Thanks for watching.